Welcome to A Scrap Life, a podcast solely focused on the hustlers, grinders, operators, and business owners who live and breathe the scrap metal industry every day. Here is your host, Brett Eckhart.
We have a special edition, A Scrap Life. Guest host, I'll say Jennifer Beth.
I love it. Go ahead. Fire us off, Jennifer.
And we've got a pretty unique setup here. We are actually not in Idaho for A Scrap Life.
No.
Nope. We are actually down in Houston, Texas, and we are at the Fast Market Steel and Scrap North America 2024. And it's a little busy here, but we were managed to get a good friend in the industry down, Randy Charles, founder of Greenway Steel, and I thought it would be kind of a unique opportunity to talk about what's happening in steel and scrap and what's happening on the carbon front and being efficient, and thought it'd be a good opportunity to introduce you to it. So,
outstanding.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Randy. I think ultimately, this is probably the conference that kind of for you, because it's both. It's like a mix, right? It's the input side and the output side, and I mean, for those of you that don't know, just kind of give everybody a little bit of background on Greenway and kind of what you're about and why a conference like this could be important to you.
Well, first, thanks, of course, for the
Absolutely.
opportunity to get introduced and talk a little bit about the steel business. It's something I could talk about for a long time.
Yeah.
So, the interesting thing is, Houston, I've been in the steel business since 1989, more than a few years. I've been coming down to Houston probably every year in some way, shape, or form to talk steel and the business, and particularly, with the energy markets. And that's why it's really fascinating to be here today. Greenway Steel was founded in support of sustainability across the metal supply chain and manufacturing industry. So the idea being that the steel mills are investing billions of dollars to decarbonize in industry, and then manufacturers needing to meet a demand for sustainable products. So Greenway Steel was essentially founded to connect those dots. So it's all about the supply chain. When you get right down to it, sustainability, at least from my perspective, and I think from our perspective in the industry, is really a laser focus on energy and energy consumption. Because ultimately the most efficient mills, most efficient processes are going to have, probably the longest term sustainability, and as well also provide for a lowest carbon footprint. And, being in Houston, in the heart of the energy market, it's good to be here and to be part of that scene today at this conference. Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why the EAF furnaces came to be in the first place, right? Was to create a more efficient product, lower energy cost, right? Yeah,
that's really the cool thing about the industry in the U.S., in particular the steel industry in the U.S., is that the EAFs were there's really a focus on energy efficiency and efficiency of production and processing. So of course it started with long products, and then Nucor at Yamato did it with near net shape casting for structural products, and then ultimately they put the mill in Crawfordsville to do it flat rolled. And really, you fast forward to today and you take what was a laser focus on energy intensity. And I mean, every month we looked at energy intensity, as long as I've been at Nucor for 25 plus years. And then today you just convert it over to what? Emissions intensity. Yeah. And here you are at the lowest footprint. And what's cool about that is that, in Europe, where a lot of this is being driven by a regulated market, with the emissions trading system, here in the U.S., in a voluntary market, it was done for all the right reasons. It was done for cost efficiency, energy savings, and that's where we're at today.
At what point does all the right reasons, because I'm a business guy, right? Dollars and cents are important, right? So at what point does all the right reasons intersect with actual efficiencies and cost reductions and the things that go along with, quote unquote, all the right reasons?
Yeah, right at the end of the day, at least in the U.S., a free market capitalist society, the right reasons for business ultimately are, it's about turning over a profit for your investors,
Absolutely.
your stakeholders, supporting your customers and your clients. So it really is, a laser focus, again, I keep coming back to this, a bit on energy and energy consumption. So, if you look at a world in which, kilowatt hours and this electrification, and it's just going to be so critical to understand kilowatt hours and understand, not at the end of the month what your power bill is in terms of dollars, but ultimately, the kilowatt hours of consumption and then your options around kind of reducing that and becoming more efficient. And number one, you're going to save money, right, with a laser focus on energy efficiency. But number two, the other reason is that the supply chains and the end users are ultimately going to look for people to help them to create these solutions around a sustainable supply chain. So I think that early on in this cycle, as it develops in the years ahead, if you're out there in front of it, you have the opportunity to take on some market share that other people might not be associated with. So there's two components, right? There's the cost savings, and then there's the market share side of the equation. I think that are, if you will, the right reasons for doing this.
Which that makes more sense to me is if it's a market share driven, if there's an opportunity for you to grab market share that otherwise wouldn't be available to you because you're willing to just at the very minimum keep track of your carbon footprint, right? And making an effort to sustain it, reduce it, whatever that amounts to. But it feels like it kind of reminds me in a way of when we first got into the e-scrap business and there was no R2 certification. It was just a free-for-all, right? Just if you had electronic scrap, if you had computers or whatever, it was just those were high commodity value items, and they went each way. They went 8 ways sideways, right? And could export containers all over. And then R2 and Rios came in. Okay, there's some certification that needs to be attributed to if you're going to do it, quote unquote, the right way. And is there some similarities to that?
Yeah, well, I'll reference quality systems in the 90s here, but let me ask you, if you were one of the first, if you will, businesses or firms to jump onto that, did it open up market share to you over some of the competition maybe? By being able to provide some certification or reliability in that regard?
I think what it did is it allowed the bigger players to get bigger in the fact that it allowed them, because they had the bandwidth in place on the back end, on the admin side, to go through the process. Because if you've ever looked at what it takes to be R2 certified or Rios, it's a lot of accounting, ISO 9000 and whatever certified, and it really goes into that. Now, I think if you were a smaller player that decided to deploy the capital to push into that, it created a host of opportunity for you. It opened up doors that you never would have had with companies that never would have given you a shot because of your size. You're like, oh, that little company can't service me. But then when you walked in and you had this certification and this certification, it now allowed you a seat at the table, at a table you might not have ever been invited to if you hadn't gone through that process.
Yeah, that's a cool perspective. And right, when folks, if you're purchasing and you're dealing with a lot of large companies that kind of have leverage, you're always looking for smaller companies to come in. And if they're willing to do some of these extra things that kind of give, the buyers some kind of, feeling of confidence that they've got a handle on managing their business, that these certifications represent.
Yeah.
I mean, you can make some progress, but I'll step back, as you mentioned ISO. And, in the 90s, when the quality systems were implemented at the time, and I was at Sparrows Point, Bethlehem Steel at the time, and we implemented, I think, the first ISO 9000 system within the steel industry. But, a lot of folks were thinking, well, do I want to do this? How do I do it? And ultimately, the automotive companies got on board and created the QS 9000, and you could see over the years how it got implemented. And really, you could jump in early and be part of that game, or you could wait 10 years and get involved, at which point it was becoming just table stakes, so to speak. And in much the same way I see this developing around sustainability, but I've got to tell you, I think it's bigger than just being part of the supply chain, because I think it opens up avenues for finance. Number one, it opens up avenues for finance if it's green bonds or those kind of things. But number two, I think it prepares you for a regulatory environment, down the road sometime that could involve, liability associated with carbon and emissions. I mean, we see that developing now, particularly in oil and gas, but it's only going to translate across the industry. And of course, around the world it's happening.
Yeah.
Well, if you take out the regulation side of it, I think you're going to see just some larger companies more or less heavily encouraging that from their suppliers. There is a rumor that Nucor might go down that path for some of their raw material suppliers in the upcoming years. Like that might be something that happens, and so that's, why we're kind of discussing it now. Of okay, well, how do you handle that as a metal recycling facility? How do you handle that with all the tons that come in and out of a yard every single month, right? Like, how do you prepare for that?
That's all part of what's called Scope 3 emissions, your full value chain. So Scope 1 and Scope 2, that's day to day. I mean, your power bills, the diesel you're consuming, what you're spending, and that's your Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Pretty straightforward. I mean, we simplified it with our Greenway calculator and tailored it for manufacturers in the steel industry and the supply chain. But really, it's a Scope 3 emissions that create a lot of the controversy around this, and that's the full value chain. And that's where people start to think, hey, this could get awfully complex. And I agree, it can if you go down that rabbit hole, but at some point you only have to really focus on what's meaningful for the business. And in our case, the value chain in steel, it's going to be raw materials, it's going to be logistics. Purchase goods and logistics. And if you're not already laser focused on those in the first place, well, then you're missing out on an opportunity. But you could convert that over to the emissions and the footprint. And frankly, there are 3 reasons why people do this kind of thing. First is the corporate accounting, which, might fall under a public company and SEC requirements or California requirements. But number 2, and here's where we see a lot of demand, is on supply chains. For a global steel and aluminum part supply chain, say to a major automotive manufacturer, tier 1 supplier going to it. So you've got the supply chain component of it. What's the footprint associated with it? Because, these large international companies are laser focused on hitting some targets in the future. But then number 3, and this is an interesting one too, is you could look at it from a product marketing perspective. And you could say, hey, look, here I'm a domestic supplier here, and here's my footprint associated with the supply chain. But you might have an option from overseas, and they're telling you they had a lower cost, but really when you look at it, it's a much higher footprint. It truly is at a lower cost over the long haul. Yeah. Is it more sustainable over the long haul? And so there's 3 different ways you could look at this thing.
I think I see where you're going with it. I see the value in it, only because I think I recently had a meeting with a global cement producer, right? And those guys have got, and he was giving me the numbers, and I'm not going to even try and repeat them because I'll be incorrect. But he was talking about that the concrete cement industry is responsible for X amount of the emissions, right? Globally. And so what they were trying to do is shrink their footprint as a company to XYZ, and part of that was going to be their input material, right? Whether they were going to go from, say whole tires to a TDF material, which is shredded 3/4 inch, right? Which is why we were having the conversation, because currently we supply them with whole tires, and they're saying, well, if you can make a TDF product, we can burn this much more efficiency on an efficiency front. We can now take, instead of this many tons, we can double, and if we can take tires as our input, then we can basically carbon calculate that, and we reduce our emissions by X amount towards our overall goal. And so I guess where I'm going with that is it's already here, and it's going to affect the small, medium-sized businesses more, than you would think. And you can sit there and you can argue against the regulation, and you can complain about it and say, we need new elected officials or whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, it's here, so you can. Probably the best way to do, in my opinion, is I'm more let's figure out a way to use it to our advantage versus try and dodge it.
That's right.
And I'm looking forward to your panel as well. That's why you're here. What's the full description of your panel that you're on here?
It's ESG and technology around green steel, and it was interesting how ESG got put into that subject, because it really it's more focused. At least it seems to me. My understanding of the panel, what we want to talk to, and if you look at Boston Metal and Nucor being part of that panel, really the focus is on sustainability and low carbon embedded products. Steel production is really where it's been. And I got to go back to the discussion on the cement, because that's one of those products, not unlike steel, that is globally recognized as being a high emitting kind of industry, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, was that an international company, European company operating in the United States?
Correct.
Yeah, so that's where a lot of this is coming from, because
100%.
Within the EU, it's just not confined to their borders. And you make a good point, because ultimately they have to get to the bottom of their Scope 3 emissions, full value chain. And that's where many of the smaller and medium-sized companies are going to be impacted, because they're going to come down and say, hey, you got to help us out. We need to understand that. And it really is not that complex. At least we simplified it with what we do in our understanding of the greenhouse gas protocol. So that was the whole purpose of it. But that's only the base starting point, is you get to where you're at with the accounting of your emissions. But then the real fun begins when you start to focus on solutions for efficiency.
Do you see, and I'm pretty ignorant to this, I don't pretend to know a lot about it, but do you see an opportunity down the road for small, medium-sized recycling companies? And I say recycling, whether it's scrap metal, whether it's plastic, tires, whatever, an opportunity to produce and sell the carbon credits that they would be potentially creating by operating a recycling business?
Yeah, Jennifer and I got into this project with the client and helping to understand where those opportunities were for the credits, and really it was on the refrigerants and the collection of the refrigerants. Now, there's two components to what you could do with the refrigerants. You could recycle them, get them back in, so that prevents more from being produced, or you could destroy them. Now, when you destroy them is when you actually get the credits. Otherwise, you're just recycling, putting them back into the market circularity and all that. Now, people will want to purchase those because they don't have the same footprint on the accounting standpoint when you recycle something, which you're well aware of. But that's the real opportunity. I think that, number one, that's one opportunity there. Now, on the credit side, a lot of people will ask me about that. Can I generate credits by, my process of what I'm doing? And you got to think about it. Well, you're really recycling something, you're selling it back into the market. The opportunity exists that your clients and your customers are actually reducing their carbon footprint by purchasing your product. So there's that's more in my mind.
That's the bigger opportunity.
It's a marketing standpoint.
Opening up markets for your goods, right?
Yeah. Think about what you could do. Your clients, you could basically at the end of the year send them a note and say, hey, by the way, here's how much carbon you saved with all the business you did with us. You could it's a certificate, and
no, I can see the
component of this.
Because and where you're going with that too is the reason I was talking to another company, and they handle all the because there's a financial incentive in there somewhere, potentially down the road. And the financial incentive, what he was basically explaining to me at the time was, because we were, and this is just like probably a personal question than anything, was on the tire side, because we are actually taking a waste, destroying it all the way down to create a fuel that can be burned. And that's where they were kind of trying to back into the credit side. But ultimately, they're going to look at us as a key supplier for that material if we can provide it, at a certain amount of volume, just because we have the ability to produce something that they need to lower their carbon footprint.
That's right.
I think that's the bigger opportunity for recycling companies in general.
Without a doubt. But hey, we'll take a step back to the idea around the credits. Now, this is, again, a voluntary market, the United States, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if someone's willing to buy your credit that you produce, by all means, produce it and sell it.
Yeah.
But now the question, if I were talking to a partner client of mine and we were looking at some credit for some offsetting solutions, I mean, I might be skeptical of some of them, and I might say, you might not want to go down. But that's some of what, the issues around credits right now. If you go back 5 and 10 years, people are starting to look back at some of these nature-based credits and said, did they really do what they were supposed to do? And a lot of people are saying, probably not. But I think as time goes on, the accounting of them and the technology behind them, and people are going to start to say, yeah, I get that one. Yes, that really is generally doing something positive and doing well. And oftentimes, here in the U.S., I think in particular, we'll probably look at some engineered solutions that, it absolutely is doing what it's supposed to do. So it'll have some value. you know, there'll be a lot of value, probably more expensive, the technology behind it, but it'll have value. People will be willing to invest in it. But that's the beauty of a voluntary market, you know, here in the U.S. as opposed to a regulated market. You think about a regulated market, right? You want to meet the minimum and maybe look for loopholes.
Yeah.
Okay. In a voluntary market here in the U.S., you really want to do what's right for your stakeholders, for your team, for your clients, and your community. Now, it might be a little more difficult, complex to make those decisions because you don't have guardrails, so to speak. You don't have a price for carbon, perhaps. But at the end of the day, you're really analyzing your business and your clients, what their demands are, what their needs are, and you're doing what's right for the business. And so it could be more efficient in some respects, being a voluntary market. You know? It's fascinating time, man. I've been in steel business for a long time, and I got to tell you, what we are seeing transpire is it just got me energized in a way that, 30 years in steel, and I'm still looking at it and say, this is just a fascinating industry to be a part of.
That was going to be my next question. Was for you is how does a steel man go from making steel, being involved in steel distribution, steel manufacturing to Greenway Steel and working on the carbon side? What created the opportunity, or what created the move for you?
Thank you. That's a cool question, and it was a good friend of mine that took on the chief commercial role. A guy by the name of Mark Buell took on the chief commercial role with H2 Green Steel in Sweden, and I got to understanding what he was doing, and I started to research a little bit about this hydrogen, and introducing hydrogen into steel making. And then I started to understand, some of what came out of the Paris Accords relative to emissions reductions, and some of what was going on, how steel was a component of that. And I started filling up notebooks on research, and ultimately started writing what are now my Greenway articles. And really it was just going to be a blog spot. But then started talking to carbon traders around the country, got introduced to Mobius Risk Group, who I have a lot of respect for now as a strategic partner in my company. And one thing led to another, and I really got an understanding that across the supply chain, people are going to need help with understanding this carbon accounting. And it's some way, shape, or form, ultimately the company's going to represent supply chains. And there's going to be, like I said, we're here to connect the dots. And in some way, shape, or form, we're going to represent supply chains. And I don't know what that's going to look like. I mean, I got some ideas of what it can look like, but it's all going to be a part of creating the most efficient supply chains that ultimately are the most sustainable. And look, all my career in steel has been focused on new technology and new products. And now we're in just such a broad scope of new technology.
The beauty of entrepreneurship, right? Like you don't ever know where it's going to go. You're just kind of, you start here, and you think the market's here, and Jennifer and I know this all too well, and maybe the market's over here, but you're still just kind of trying to figure out like where there's a fit, there's a need, and there's going to be a need, and it's just how do you like fill that need, and where are you needed the most, because that's where there's the most opportunity for your business.
It's been referred to me as a pivot. You pivot the business, but let me ask you though, your experience. You've been doing that a lot longer than me. Now I've been doing, I guess, when introducing products, to our clients, our customers, when I went in the steel industry. But there's so many opportunities that start to come to you. Yeah. Man, I got so much time to take them all.
I know. We know that. Jennifer and I have had this conversation many times on the marketing side, and a lot of it is, there's like a quote out there, and I should know it, but I don't. But it was like, where's the best place to set up a hot dog stand, in New York City or over here, and they basically just say, like, none of the above. It's a starving market, right? Wherever there's people starving, they're willing to pay the most because there's an opportunity there that exists the most. So it's not necessarily the best location as much as like where does the market the hungriest for something that you can provide. And I feel like for you, like as time evolves, you're starting to identify where people could use you the most and your services the most, and that's where you'll have the most success.
It's a combination of things. You make a good point at early on, folks were, okay, now we got this data, what do we do with it? And they want to start creating sustainability reports. And I said, well, that's a little broader than my expertise where we're going to go with, but it kept coming back. So we partnered up with McAllen, actually a Texas-based firm.
Not the whiskey.
Yeah, no. That's next.
I just heard McAllen. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
we're going to work on the whiskey side next. But we'll go reduce their footprint, man. But but now we bring those services to our clients. So really creating the sustainability report, but it's all about the message. But you got to do it in a way that meets some of the liabilities and the legal framework around reporting this kind of thing, and that's what they're experts at doing. So we partnered up and we bring those solutions. Jennifer, we were actually involved in a pretty cool technology side of the equation. Some folks had reached out to us looking for a sustainable supply of a metals product, small diameter stainless tube. They were having a hard time finding it. They're buying it from Alibaba, right?
Yeah.
And they said, we got to have a domestic. And it was Jennifer that actually pointed us in the right direction.
I was like, put me in, coach. We've got recycled materials here. We've got EAFs here. Like, we can find you a much lower carbon footprint product.
Yeah.
And stateside.
And stateside, do business domestically where there's opportunity, and like help each other out, right? And I think that's the biggest thing that we're all trying to do here, even at a conference like this, right? Like, you're trying to meet, introduce, generate connections, and so you can down the road, you're like, if somebody comes to you with a question or an opportunity, you're like, I know the person for that, and I know someone, at least I know a good starting point for someone for you to talk to. And that's what I love. That's why we're willing to fly from Idaho to Houston, and Jennifer from California
on 3 hours to sleep,
reason, right? I mean, because we want that, and it's important.
Yes, it really is a very interesting career pivot that you've taken. Your decades of experience, and you saw where this is headed, and you just put up your hand. You're like, I can do this. I can help you out.
Well, myself and my team, of course. With Emily and April, who are also here, Director of Operations and Director of Client Success. I mean, you're talking 40 plus years again in the steel industry, working with our customers and our partners in the supply chain. So many of the people that we're working with are people I've worked with my entire career. I'm not talking about the day-to-day movements in the price of steel. Like I only had done for 30 years. We're talking about, picking up an order or a different product or developing a new product. Well, we are developing a new product, but it's just we're bringing solutions ultimately to people that, we've worked with for a long time. I mean, you got to admit, this business is pretty cool. When you work with people for a long time, you bring them solutions and you develop trust with them, and you find that, you can make some good things happen. That's part of the fun in working, right?
How do we meet, Jennifer?
You and I mean, years ago, I used to try to buy your scrap during my Nucor DJJ days.
That's how long we've known each other.
That was a few companies ago.
8?
Yeah.
2008.
Yeah.
Well, that was an interesting time, wasn't
It was a wild time.
Yeah.
It's an easy time to remember. It was a good year and a bad year all wrapped into one.
it? The best year you ever had, and the worst year you ever had. Oh, man, I got stories.
Yes.
I've got stories.
Well, we appreciate you sitting down with us. We appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to your conversation. ESG aside, I'm more interested in the stuff that's in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, that's right.
Like that part of it, I'm super excited to hear about, and looking forward to just seeing who's at this conference this year.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate again the opportunity to meet with you and to chat a little bit about what we're doing, what we're about, and of course more people at the folks who will meet here at the conference. And thanks so much for your support in what we're doing.
Absolutely.
It's been a lot of fun working with you since we've been introduced, Jennifer. I really enjoy it.
Well, I really appreciate what you guys are putting out there, what you're working on. It definitely is a direction that our industry is heading towards, and you're on the forefront of it. For those that are listening or watching at home, you can find Randy Charles on LinkedIn. You can go to greenwaysteel.com. You can find him online if you want to get in touch and learn a little bit more about what he's working on. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Of course. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right.